Last year, one of the most Instagrammable moments from the Venice Biennial came from the Danish pavilion created by the artist Uffe Isolota. It featured a hyper-realistic world where elements from an idyllic Danish farm life of the past blend with strange sci-fi phenomena to create a haunting image of an uncertain present. A big part of these strangeness came from the weird objects, from the front gate to the moss hanging from a strange overhead structures, and weird objects scattered across the pavilion. These were the works of today's guests, Soft Baroque are Sasha Stutzin and Nicholas Gardner. Since forming their studio in London, they have been gaining critical attention with their contemporary furniture that often feels, and like in the case of the Danish pavilion, really serve as art. In their experimental approach to design, they blurred the lines between functionalism and pure joy of expression. The studio's first piece from 2014 was the Lenticularis mirror, an innovative cross between mirror and a scent diffuser. And this set the stage for their further projects. Baroque's unique designs have included commissions from the luxury fashion brand Balenciaga and Swedish design company Hem. A talk with Sasha and Nicholas was a direct request by Bill Kouligas, our dear returning guest. He also started as a designer and a musician, but is now mostly known and is mostly occupied by his music label Pan from Berlin. Pan is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and Indigo has an honor to be one of the stops in Pan's 50th anniversary global tour. Tomorrow, the festival will feature 3 artists from the label, Amnesia Scanner, Puss Mary, and DJ Asmara, and I invite you to come back tomorrow and celebrate the anniversary with us. But now, please give a warm applause to Bill and Soft Baroque.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
This is Nicholas and Sasa. I'm Bill. I'm happy to be back. Thanks again for inviting us to do this. I guess the talk today will mainly be about Soft Baroque's work. The duo started approximately 10 plus years ago in London. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about how you started, how you met.
We just started to have this conversation down there. It's sometimes really hard to actually say when the official collaboration started, because we're also in private relationship. So it started around 10 years ago with just having lots of fun, and then slowly building towards being a serious practice. But it took quite a while for us to actually jump into it full time. Because I guess it felt like maybe we're going to have to stop having fun when we're going to do it full time as a kind of our day-to-day job. Can I also just these images are all kind of squashed, I've noticed. So basically we just prepared a folder of images kind of going from 2014 to today, just chronologically, and there's going to be some working progress shots as well because we basically make all of our work, so you can get like a little bit of feel for that. Anyway, did you want to add something?
Well, I guess it's about how it started, and I think we started sort of just experimenting together, and I think I had a bit more of a practical making background, and Sasha more of an image making and a conceptual background, I suppose, you'd say.
Yeah, I mean, most of our conversations at the beginning were mini fights about Nick trying to convince me that what I want to build is basically impossible to build because my brain wasn't working actually three-dimensionally.
I guess like it was a kind of
But also it was a challenge for you, and I guess he kind of also liked that in a way.
Yeah, I mean, I've always enjoyed that side of things, just making things, and I find it very satisfying and very interesting. And that has been my kind of motivation. And then when Sasha sort of brought like a bit more of a, I guess like a kind of classical contemporary art thought process to it, a lot of it, that's when I started to think a bit more about like how could we skew functions of objects, or how could we play with the vernacular design that was out there, like mainly criticizing modernists kind of tropes or design tastes that were like in the kind of stream. And particularly for myself, I was always thinking about materials, their inherent values, their values that are kind of projected onto them, the kind of deception that's involved in certain materials where, you know, it's like printed on, or it's a veneer, or it's a kind of surface, a digital surface, or a kind of a physical embossment or something like this. So I think that's where we kind of started to connect, is like this, me much more about the kind of the bricks
like
and mortar, and Sasha a bit more about the image.
Yeah, and me also being anxious about like image being two-dimensional, because for me always when I would print an image on a paper, that paper always felt like it's three-dimensional. And as a kind of traditionally trained as a graphic designer, I just felt frustrated by that, like that view on the paper being like, you know, two-dimensional in a way, because it's not. And we met actually in London, where we did our masters at Royal College, and in the time I spent there, I was basically trying to escape this two-dimensionality of the image. And when we kind of met, okay, started to work together, we were, both kind of, you were into what you were saying, and I was kind of at the stage where I was like out of the 2D into like...
I guess initially the two different practices and perspectives on design and the methodologies that you both had kind of like shaped up what the studio has come to be to this date. And I think from my point of view, this is also like a common ground that I have with my practice. Of course, it's a very different thing, but what made me passionate about what you do a few years ago when I discovered your work was you know, like trying to unpack a lot of the potential influences, or like the world that you have created is very similar to the way I think about, you know, blending contrasting ideas and, you know, kind of like appreciating what's out there and trying to create a new language out of it. It's not necessarily about forcing things to be innovative, but it's more about like reflecting on like references and like filtering things through your own perspective. So a lot of things might be very familiar somehow, but you kind of like, at least to what I see from your work is you kind of like create your own narrative through the objects that you make. I don't know if that's part of the way you think, or like, or if it's like intuitive somehow, but
yeah, I mean, I think that there is that idea of like basically creating a kind of a parallel narrative to what's going on already in sort of capitalist or consumer culture, essentially, and we essentially like replicate some of those mechanisms where there's a kind of supply and demand kind of feedback loop, and objects get sort of, you know, created out of this like primordial ooze and whatever. And I think that we sort of look at that little story that's happening, that little narrative that's happening in a kind of more commercial sense, and we sort of like think about it in our objects. Like what would be the kind of motivations of the person wanting to kind of design, like, not design this, but like, I guess like taken to certain extremes in a way. So like a kind of classic piece of joinery is taken to a sort of a kind of almost cartoon version, or like a hyper-real version of that piece of joinery. And in doing so, it sort of replicates what happens in you know, on Amazon or whatever, where a certain kind of a style or topology or functional item just gets like juiced up, you know, because it gets sort of like people are just constantly trying to innovate it, and like this kind of relatively useless thing just gets like completely distorted. And like, so I think those sort of like little mechanisms are kind of interesting to me, at least, maybe, and we sort of like thought about that in our design, and it's a little bit of a critique of it, but it's also just the way it is, and it's kind of nice to sort of play with it and be a little bit of a part of it. Yeah.
There's a very playful and artful kind of notion in the things that you do, and I wonder how you navigate between making ultimately art objects, but also objects that have a certain utility, because they're ultimately furniture for people to use. And I wonder, and also you have equally exhibited in art spaces and institutions, but also you have produced commercial items that, you know, people consume and use on a daily basis. How do you define, or if there's some distinction between the two, or like how have you actually managed to create that world that can coexist in parallel spaces somehow?
I think it's just kind of like always like in the back of our minds, because we just don't feel, I mean, even though we operate like artists would, for us kind of function is somehow like the red thread between like all of the objects, even though they're like super different and they all, you know, speak about a different concept and idea. And sometimes, yeah, we talk about it and we're like, oh, maybe we can just forget about it, you know, let's just be artists, like whatever, you know. But then it's just our inner tendency in a way to like create some sort of...
Do you feel that certain industries or an audience can be open to that? Because I work, my main medium is sound, but I practice a lot of my sound work also in the art field or also in the fashion field, and I collaborate with a lot of people that some of the artists also, again, like they do a lot of styling, for example, and stuff like that, and they have told me over the years that they have suffered quite a lot by trying to have an art career while being also stylist, because it kind of like undervalues the, you know, like the main role of being an artist and so forth.
I mean, I don't really care how I'm called, and like people call us all sorts of things. I'm like, yeah, not too concerned about that. I'm more thinking about like what you said, you know, about the function of things. And basically, I just wanted to say that that's something that's important to us, and I guess that kind of, in a way, distinguishes us from like a fine artist, because we like our things to be consumed, even though things sometimes, I mean, if I show work that we do to my grandmother, she wouldn't really say that's a furniture at all, you know. She wouldn't even understand what it's used for. But we kind of like that this function can be like transcendent in a way, and it can
That's
be...
how my parents feel when they listen to the music.
a lot of different things, you know. And sometimes we call something, I don't know, whatever, like a planter, but then a person who's going to buy it is going to call it something else, going to turn it upside down, and we don't really care, you know, what's the end use, but we do like the idea.
And I guess this openness kind of is quite visible through your kind
We're not
of like
super
ongoing,
tight about it.
Yes.
Unless we get a commission where we have to make a shelf or we have to make a bench or,
But yeah, I guess in regards to like, I guess it's a bit more of like the nuts and bolts of like the art and design world about valuing work and things like this. And I think that it does, in a strange way, I think it's much more difficult to be kind of an artist that has, you know, you can earn a living from it and you can get reasonably big commissions or you can sell things. And I think that that's quite a difficult point to get to in a weird way, because it's, you know, it's a, you know the world, but like in our world we have a little bit more flexibility just to kind of do projects that are a little bit more practical, but personally I like doing that very much. So I like thinking about a kind of a client in a sort of more traditional designer-maker relationship, a little bit like an architect would kind of talk to the person who they're building their home for and kind of try and accommodate their lifestyle or whatever, or their kind of ideas. So in a weird way, I don't think an artist, maybe modern artists don't really do that so much. I mean, back in the day, like maybe 300 years ago, when there wasn't really a name for like an artist, really. It was more of an artisan or something like this. You know, it would be much more collaborative with the, you know, there's documents of great artists where they basically just describe exactly what they want, you know. I want like Virgin Mary with like blue dress and,
yeah,
you know.
but we don't really do that. We operate more, that was my point, we operate as an artist in a way because we don't get those commissions that often we show our work in a gallery, and then those people come for the gallery and they see the work and then they want something like that, you know, so.
Yeah. Well, we do, I guess like a kind of a whole, we do like 5 different things, I guess. Like we do special projects for like specific clients that are a bit larger, and then we do like private commissions for people's houses or for people's whatever, and then we do gallery shows, and then we do just whatever we kind of want to explore.
Yeah, but I'm just saying most of these things come from a gallery setting, right?
Yeah, I suppose so, yeah. The ideas, are first kind of premiered there.
But I guess what Nick is trying to say is that his long-term dream is to have like a house on top of the mountain where he can just like carve wood and...
Maybe, I don't know.
Working with music over the past 20 years plus, it has been a very necessary part of my work to manifest a lot of these ideas in physical space. Physicality has always been a very important part of my work, and documenting music on physical objects like records and CDs in the past and so on, and also like curating events and like gathering in a physical environment and kind of like performing like we're doing here actually today and tomorrow. It's all I want to say is that like it's been a very vital aspect of what I do, because music has an abstract form, but like the physicality, the tangibility is a very, it's always been kind of like the leading force for these things to kind of like communicate a lot of the sound works that we have been doing. And I wanted to ask, what does a physical object mean to you, and why there's so much emphasis on it, especially at a time that there's so much overpowering in the digital era that we live in, and you know, you're almost like stepping back and like kind of like appreciating, you know, things that come from nature ultimately, and obviously the urban environment that we live in, and how those two kind of like have influenced your work, and you know, how do you actually express yourself through physicality basically, and materiality as well. Especially that's more of a question also for Sasa, because you said that you come from you said graphic design initially, which is more of a 2D kind of world, and then obviously through the collaboration that you both have over the past 10 years, you have shifted into more like a 3D dimensional objects. And like how did you find yourself diving more into physical elements of your work?
Well, actually, it started, I guess, like when I mentioned before, when I was doing my master's, I got obsessed with this idea, you know, like what I was just trying to find like 1,000 different ways of how I could like expand like 2-dimensional into 3-dimensional. So I was playing with that a lot, just as a kind of little obsession activity I had. But then parallel to that, I got really interested more theoretically into smell, which I guess I was just like studying a lot kind of senses and all of that, and I realized, you know, it's really like marginalized part of our like bodies that we kind of don't really use up to its full potential. We use our eyes quite well, our ears, blah, blah, blah. And then with that kind of came also this enigma like smell, you know, being this like invisible substance like music in a way, you know. So I was kind of like somewhere between those two things. And then, yeah, basically the first object that we made together was this like mirror perfuming this like cloud out, which kind of obscured like
was
really...
a mirror diffuser, right?
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
something.
So when you were kind of standing in front of the mirror, you couldn't, it was like kind of standing in a cloud, but also you were getting perfumed and yeah, so basically at that point, like touching things and kind of holding them became like, I guess, important for me in a way, because that was like almost resolving a problem, you know?
And Nicholas, you've been obviously practicing physical, like actual furniture design, I guess,
but
in a
then,
more
like,
traditional
I mean,
sense.
some of our ideas as well kind of did dip into very digital environments and...
Yeah. There were a few kind of concepts that married like digital, I guess like digital ideas with sort of practical making of objects and the kind of interaction between those two. But yeah, going back to what you were saying about like personal motivation or satisfaction, I guess. I think for me, it really, from a more like selfish perspective, I just like really enjoy the process of just like making something in 3D or like making something, and all the kind of the sort of like just the stuff that goes along with that, you know, like just like how materials behave and the way that they feel and what they say, obviously, and the way that they kind of respond when you work with them. I think that there's like people who are making music or something like that also get similar personal satisfaction. And then there's like another sort of layer to that, which is like when you're making it for someone, or someone can enjoy it, or you can enjoy it yourself, like after it's finished. Or you make it or for somebody else. What's kind of complicating that is essentially, like Instagram or whatever is like, now it's like so predominantly image-based, everything, and essentially like the most people that view our pieces are, you know, viewing an image of it, and it's not really, so to kind of ignore that part of it, ignore the fact that it is essentially the product has become a little bit more of an image than the real deal. I guess for sculptors and for painters it's the same, it's a kind of problem that we haven't really no one has really addressed very clearly, and it kind of disturbs us a little bit sometimes, not in a kind of bad way, but we're just kind of like, well, it'd be nice if there was like a way to be a bit more, I guess like the actual objects are more accessible and more touched and more used or something like this, and by more people, a little bit like a restaurant, you know, you get to serve it people every day and it's very satisfying, and you get to make something.
I guess it gives a different meaning also to the work, you know. It becomes more real somehow, and
But then also, I guess, just to like be a bit more light about the whole kind of situation, is that when there's some like a lot of projects that came out also just out of very simple, basic experimentation with materials, you know, like especially when we're in London, there's this like culture that sounds really strange, like if I would imagine it here, but it really works in London. Basically, if you want to get rid of anything, you put it outside your house, and it's going to be gone no matter what it is in 5 minutes. It's impressive. It's basically some sort of really good like cleaning system for the city as well. So we would often just like pick stuff from the side of the road, you know, like people would put out like big mirrors and like weird cupboards and their strange little objects, and we would always ride to our studio. So Nick would always just like, you know, put stuff on his shoulders and bring it to the studio, and then we would like just play with materials. And so it is like also this very light approach in a way. Or, you know, we would have friends, architects, and they would have like massive load of like leftover materials and drop it in our studio, and we would just cut it and bend it and then be like, oh, what about this? What about that? And it does kind of also make, like, we both have, theoretical knowledge and knowledge about the history of design and art, but so it is like, it's not just like coming and doing it out of nowhere. We have obviously like kind of ideas in the back of our head, but it's also just kind of playing with stuff sometimes and then putting it together afterwards, or it just kind of comes naturally, like, right?
Yeah, I think that there's like a few ways to go about thinking about an object, or kind of like coming up with an object. And sometimes it is just a kind of like a material experiment that's sort of interesting, and then that kind of morphs into sort of like a piece, it adds another element, or the shape or the function kind of has some conversation with that material experiment or that material kind of distortion. So I think for us it's like a little bit, it's not collage necessarily, but it's a little bit like, yeah, just kind of putting things together and seeing what they say.
Have you been using specific materials? I mean, I know you have a very distinct language that obviously it's ever expanding. But from the little I know, at least, like, you have used a lot of different type of kind of like techniques in different materials over the years, and I wonder if you kind of like emphasize or focus on like specific materials at the time that you kind of like investigate and examine and like see their performance and the.
It kind of
or
depends.
if you just use a plethora of
it depends, because sometimes we have an
kind
idea.
of like put together. Huh?
Yeah, sometimes we have an idea before we know what material.
I'm not a designer, so that comes more from a naive place, just out of curiosity.
It works always. Like, sometimes we have an idea and then we try to find material that's the most suitable for that, or sometimes we have a material that we basically just really want to work with, because we want to do something out of that.
Makes sense.
And sometimes we make our own materials.
I think it also has there's a kind of track that's also like quite DIY in a weird way. Like, we always think about what we can do ourselves. Like, there's some processes that we outsource, but it's usually in a very controlled way. Like, for example, like, you send them a digital file, they can't really. There's no kind of hand. There's no hand of the other, like the operator or whatever in it. So we kind of know what to expect. Whereas, and then everything else we sort of like design around what we can do. The tools that we have, or the skills that we have, or the amount of time that it will take for us to do, or reasonably. So, in a weird way, that is also part of the end product. Or the end design is like the kind of the production of it in a weird way. Like, I can tell kind of stories about each of the items up there, but like, we just made quite a few pieces with stainless steel tubes that were all sort of bent, kind of cut and bent in sort of like doing little gymnastics and kind of strange joints and things like this. A little bit of like a riff on stainless steel handrails and things like that. And the process of doing that was very much done by another company. They laser cut the tubes on their kind of big $200,000 machine, and we sort of just got them as raw material. But the kind of process of it didn't require us to have any special tools to put them together and fit them together. So I think that there's or bending the tubes would require like a special kind of tool that we didn't have. So we made like large cutouts that allowed you to just bend it by hand, for example. So the design was kind of informed by the accessibility for us in our kind of relatively, it's a good workshop, but it's not like.
I guess in your case, again, to go back to something we discussed earlier, it depends on the functionality of every individual object that you create. Because if it's something that needs to get more commercialized, which means it needs larger manufacturing, it needs to also, the materials need to kind of like be able to be replicated, I guess, in multiple items. Because some of the other stuff can be, if it's like a one-off piece,
Yeah, you can afford
that
to
applies
spend way
more
more
as an
time
art
on it.
object. Somehow it can easily be.
Yeah. But I think as well, like just from that perspective as well, like we kind of pretend, even though they get exhibited in a gallery or in these contexts, sometimes we kind of pretend that they are being produced by like a producer as like part of their internal story of like this object. Yeah, so it's like what would, like according to these new, like a certain set of sort of fake design parameters that we've applied to this piece, like what would a kind of a normal industrial designer, how would they treat the manufacture of this object? It's a bit of like an abstract kind of thought experiment or something like this, but it's quite a nice like way to resolve certain things. You know, there's this, the kind of object is a kind of a joke or an absurd or a send up of like something, but then the kind of actual execution of it is quite careful and kind of thoughtful. So yeah, I think. What do you think? Yeah.
A big part of your practice is also collaborative. You've worked with a lot of different people. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that, on how is it to be getting commissions or contributing works into a bigger kind of project that kind of like your piece becomes, you know, part of a kind of like wider conversation somehow.
Yeah, I think that's always a nice opportunity for us, I guess, as well, because the scale we work on is like pretty kind of human body related, so very kind of domestic style sizes. And when we do collaborations like the Venice Pavilion that I didn't mention before, which I already totally forgot that we did, because for some reason I just forget about everything that we do like a year ago, was really nice because it allows us, like we're also, okay, like another thing, we're both like quite restless. A lot of like our friends that work in the same field, they would mostly like go with like they develop this one craft, you know, and then that's their signature thing. And we're always like a bit restless and we just want to do a new experiment and a new thing, and like for some reason it worked for us. Like nobody told us like, hey, you have to stop, you have to sell for one project. But then sometimes that's also like in a way bad, because we stay on this like very domestic scale and we imagine these things being much bigger and part of like a bigger system, but we don't have time, or you know, we don't do it ourselves because that's not the scale we work on. So the Venice was really nice because the artists came to us and saw the basically bench that we made and asked us to work on proposal together, and imagined that like we would build basically a frame of the space using that technique. And that was a really nice opportunity for us to basically take an old idea and expand it into like a more, like a bigger scale basically, and see how that works. So we've been kind of like trying to take now these opportunities, because in past we've been always way too restless, and now we're trying to like do a bit of both. Yeah, I guess it just like allows you to, like a storytelling is a bit stronger, you know, it allows you to like...
How big of an input has this been throughout your career so far? Like working with also like, you know, because you get a lot of ideas, I assume, from all these different people, and that kind of like allows you to maybe potentially at least go beyond your known language in order to, you know, expand a little bit on maybe specific needs of a project, or you know, or like just kind of like allowing also your imagination to go a little further than...
Yeah, I personally find it a bit relieving to have a couple of parameters or restrictions, or kind of like, I find it a little bit easier to think when there's like a little bit of a box sometimes. Like, okay, it has to sort of function this way, or you know, it has to be this size or something like this. So like personally, I quite creatively, I like that. But maybe on other cases where it's been like a very open-ended kind of thing, like a show, for example, there's been a lot more like sturm und drang, or like just like anxiety about like that, you know, like what's important to show, or what's important to explore, or what's important to explain through the pieces. And so like I think it's just a kind of to and fro between those two. I'm not sure if that totally responded to what you said, but yeah.
It makes sense.
Can I just like a technical thing, like, because the images are, there's not like, the images are still not in the right format, and there's like way more images and videos, so I don't think the full folder is playing. Anyway, okay.
Is there anything you would like to share that you're currently working on that's exciting for you? I know you're doing a lot of stuff at the same time, but...
Well, we like have quite a bit of, like during COVID, I guess, we got approached by, because a lot of, like, you know, the industry kind of shut down, so we got approached by quite few people to work on more production pieces, which we kind of started to work then, and it's a lot of things, it's kind of still in the progress. We've also just like finished 2 big shows that we had on, so we're supposed to have another one, but we kind of postponed it because we felt like we want to have like a little bit time to reflect.
You mean exhibitions?
Yeah. Sometimes it just also feels a bit like intense, and we're like, we don't need to have this crazy tempo, you know? And also things need time to like be made well. And we basically are at the moment reflecting a lot, and also, I mean, yeah, working on a lot of workshops and...
Yeah, I think a couple of works in stone with a stone supplier, not supplier, but like kind of a producer. So we've got 2 kind of projects like that. We haven't really worked in, we've done the kind of marble pieces that are broken and kind of put back together with fiberglass, but we haven't really worked with stone on this level with like a big producer, so that's kind of interesting. And I guess, yeah, like there's just like a kind of a bunch of projects, nothing that is particularly interesting to share in terms of like a story or anything like that. They're reasonably, yeah, I guess so. But I think like for us, we're always sort of like doing very small kind of experiments, material experiments and things like this. And like there's a kind of constant like flow of like half-finished, small kind of versions of pieces for the future. So I think that's kind of like a period of time that we're going to produce like a little bit more experimentation and things like this.
And I guess like every couple of years we get to a stage where it's like there is a room in what we do for our studio to expand, you know, beyond like 2 of us and basically scale up. Because we do say no to things, and we do just like pick things that we just kind of feel they're fun to do, and which is like really good spot to be. So we're like always a bit like, well, why would we change what we have, because it's actually really good? But then you feel some sort of unknown pressure of like, well, but we need to grow and we need to, but we kind of don't. You know, if we want to continue doing things the way we do, it would be hard to imagine like doing it like differently. You know.
Right.
So we're always a bit like, yeah, so now it's the time when we're reflecting upon that again, and we're like, well, should we, you know?
That's a good way to work, I guess, without compromising or like forcing yourself to do things that feel, you know, outside the box of what you're aiming to.
Yeah, and like I was telling you before as well, like it's so hard to officially put the start of our studio, like the kind of date, you know, because we took it like super slow for this reason. We both, you know, we're in London in like super expensive city, so we just prefer to like work for other people and like build our career super slowly, because we saw our friends like going through really shitty jobs and like we just didn't want to like. We wanted to kind of skip that phase in a way, because also we didn't have a pressure of like, oh, let's do a commercially viable studio. We're just kind of having fun, and it still feels sometimes that, yeah, it's still like that.
It shows, and I think that's
like
what makes the work so special to me.
Yeah, we have like a total freedom of...
One question that just came to mind is, where does the name come from? I know the Baroque tradition kind of like encapsulates a lot of different art forms, which, from what I grasp, like you can really sense in a metaphorical way in a lot of the things that you do. But I wonder how you picked that name, or if it comes from a specific place.
Well, it was.
Well, yeah.
It was at a kind of like an exhibition, and we just sort of like.
Freeze, yeah.
We just sort of were chatting about like different artworks, you know, in a very casual way, not in a like intellectual way at all. It was just like, that looks like that or whatever. Like, and there was a picture that just had like.
But it was actually a painting
kind of
by
a puffy sort of like puffy corners, and it like were quite. Just that sort of classic Baroque sort of picture frame with like kind of almost like safety corners on it, and I think that they're Slovenian, and we just sort of like said, oh, that's like a soft Baroque thing, and we liked the way that it sort of sounded, and we started to kind of think about the meaning of it. So it was like literally just like a one-liner thing that we said, and then we just started to think about the meaning of. The word soft, and it has like a philosophical meaning, it has like a software kind of digital sense, it has like a soft power kind of like, you know, in sort of a underground insidious sort of like manipulation of some events or whatever, and then there's just the physical softness of something being like completely forgiving and for human comfort, you know.
Which is also a little bit contrasting to the Baroque tradition.
Exactly,
that's obviously so over.
And I also had this like amazing teacher at the academy here in Ljubljana called Tomaž Brejc, which made me like totally be obsessed by Baroque, because his lectures were just so good. And even after I moved to London, we like continued to have conversations like over email and stuff. And yeah, for me, like it just made so much sense. And also neither of us like, we kind of like the idea of having this mystery name and not having to like put our names on, because we're not really that, you know, we don't want to like build the name out for us or whatever. We like this kind of mysterious Soft Baroque, whatever, whoever that is, you know. It kind of gives us.
Well, there's a
like
notion of fantasy in your work, and like there's like at least to my eyes, there's a world building that's very, you know, very much. Not necessarily futuristic, because I think that term is overused, but there is as I said, there's a notion of fantasy in your world building, and I think having a project name like Soft Baroque kind of like allows that imagination to go even further than, you know, limiting to like maybe your real names that would define it somehow more as more of a commercial kind of practice.
I think for us it just sort of captured this idea of like not being like, you know, I guess like in contemporary art in general, it's kind of about being surprising or being in contrast or making kind of little commentaries that are kind of in contrast with each other. And I think like that's a little bit what the terms were, you know, they were kind of in contrast with each other. There's nothing really soft about Baroque. Like it is very sort of dogmatic and totalitarian, and like it has a very sort of like passionate kind of righteousness, I guess, or something like this. Like if you kind of soften that, it's almost like it defeats its purpose. And so for us, that kind of contradiction in terms also kind of carries through the work in a way. There's small contradictions in the pieces in terms of like material use or kind of style of a material, or a style of a function with a material. And so I think like those small contrasts for us kind of told a story about how, you know, how the design world is, or about how, we view materials and that kind of story, which is everything that we make. So I think that kind of captures it a little bit better. But yeah, it's something that we've thought about like getting rid of at some stages to become more professional. But then I don't know, I kind of like it. It It feels
I
good.
think he has defined the story so far, so
Yeah.
it's hard to let go now.
We can
See.
always fall back on our names, you know?
Yeah, exactly. I'm aware of the time, so I would like to thank you both so much for introducing us your amazing work. I don't know if we have time for questions or
Okay, you have
if there are any questions. Yeah.
Like, do we know what's the time? Huh? Oh, okay.
I have a quick question. Did the move, because you're currently here, did that in any way influence the way you make things or production, or just did the location affect the
Well, it's much
ideas?
faster because we don't need to like commute.
I think it's been quite good here. Like when we first moved here, we talked about sort of supplies of materials or things like this, and it's been great. Like we haven't really wanted for anything. There hasn't been anything that we haven't been able to find. And then also just, I think like it's like Slovenia is a great kind of place because it's very well connected, but it's also like not so big that it's just kind of like London or the UK. It's just like there's so much pressure on like small businesses and stuff there. Like within London, there's just like hardly anything for makers or for like sculptors, or it's very like overpriced, and so it's very, very difficult to get things done sometimes.
And I think it's also changing because when we started, like we would still have anodizer almost like across the road, but then by the time like 10 years later, you would need to drive like 4 hours out to the same guy, you know, because there's just like a pressure for small businesses like this of just not being able to survive. Where here, like, you have everyone pretty like close to you. We often just like drive to the places because it's so fast. But also what I like here is the proximity of like raw materials, which in London often is not. You always have to kind of, well, often you need to import things from, you know, Italy or Germany or whatever, where here it feels like you're closer to the
like
materials.
like wood or something.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Or like stone or, yeah.
it's true.
Just kind of that felt always a bit like strange in London. Even though we're like, we don't produce things on like a large scale, we are kind of aware of environmental impact and like shipping some like big granite slabs around Europe for us to make like a piece. It's much nicer here to drive to the stone yard, pick the stone, put it in a car, take it to the workshop. I mean, it's pretty like primitive and like do it yourself, but that's the way we like to operate in a way. So in those regards, like Slovenia or Ljubljana is much better. Because in London we were stuck with stuff that we found beside the road. I'm joking.
So hi, when you think about commercialization of your work, where is the limit between your idea and vision and what that commercial production needs from you?
I think like the projects that we've worked on that have, well, there's only been 1 or 2 that have actually like gone through to production, and then there's a couple that are in the works now. But I think essentially the volume has to be, depending on the company, it has to be turned down. Like you can't make something that's too sculptural or too loud. It basically just doesn't, they don't like it so much, and so because they think they can't sell it, which I think is a bit of a myth. They probably could sell them, but so you essentially have to work within their parameters a little bit, and that itself is just a sort of conceptual challenge, I think. I just think it's kind of, for me, it's just interesting to work in that way. Like, okay, this has to say something that's interesting to us. Like, okay, this is a commentary on I can't even think of something right now, but like this is a commentary on a certain topology of couch that we're then sort of manipulating or distorting. But then we'd have to, there's a kind of process of making that acceptable to somebody that would want to have it in their home. And so that kind of just that whole mechanism of doing that, I don't personally, I don't feel like it's a sacrifice in any way. I just feel like it's interesting because that's the mechanism that we're kind of critiquing as well, this sort of supply and demand, consumer and producer kind of dynamic. It's a little bit hard to explain, but like making a commercial object is it's like almost like just a mini like artwork kind of dynamic. I don't know, what do you, yeah.
I normally get a bit more like frustrated by the process. I think, yeah, maybe because you have more interest in like that aspect of things. For me, it's just not that interesting, and I also feel like the ideas just have to get like a bit too watered down sometimes. And I feel if we don't really have to do that, like why would we? I mean, I guess one pro part is that you make like object more accessible, like price point wise, which is what I like, but I don't like the process of ideas watering down too much. Because often, you know, companies would come to you and they would like pick an object that they like, and they'd be like, we want to produce this in like 10,000. And it's like, well, no, like you can't, basically. And if we want to make it like that, it's just going to become completely different objects. So why don't we just make a new object? Because it's going to make way more sense than watering down this thing. So anyway, but he sees it differently, and that's like, it's also good, it's two of us. We always like kind of pick and choose projects that we want to work on, because obviously we don't physically work on everything together anymore.
But we're still working it out, really, like really not very experienced in this sort of production world.
Yeah.
Way more like self-producing is kind of our main occupation, I guess. So we're really just feeling it out a little bit. Maybe it's going to be some mistakes, and maybe, you know, I don't think, we'll see. Yeah.
Also just like having everything in control.
Yeah.
I trust myself and like Nick's hands more than anyone else out there. So maybe it's like, yeah, it's not a good trait to have sometimes. But yeah.
Please give one more applause to our guests.